Very good.
Welcome, everyone. Purdue Extension welcomes you to Preserve Smart. This is a virtual 5-session series on safe food preservation methods. This series will be presented by a team of Mastering Home Food Preservation instructors throughout the state of Indiana. Again, my name is Abigail Creigh. Hopefully, you have been receiving email reminders from me. If you do have any questions about the series, please email me at cray@purdue.edu. I will put that in the chat box here in just a moment. A few more logistics that I would like to cover. This series is being recorded and will be available for everyone who has registered. But because we are recording, we do ask that all participants' cameras and microphones remain off during the recordings. Therefore, if you do have a question, please type this in the chat box. We will be monitoring this throughout the session today. We'll take down those questions and answer them, and then provide you with a Q&A document via an email tomorrow. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to our speaker, Molly Hogue, with Preserve Smart Dehydration 101.
Good, e Good evening, everyone. My name's Molly Hogue, as Abigail said, and I'm work for Purdue Extension here in Indiana, and I'm going to be talking tonight about dehydration. Drying is one of the oldest methods of preservation. It can either be an alternative to canning or freezing, or actually complement either of these methods. It's simple, safe, and easy to learn. With modern food dehydrators, you can make food leather, banana chips, pumpkin seeds, beef jerky all year round at home. And these are ideal foods for backpacking and camping. They can be lightweight and don't require refrigeration. Drying food preserves food by removing the water from the food and moisture that makes microorganisms grow. So when you remove the moisture, there are no microorganisms growing, which would make the food unsafe to eat later. Most foods contain more than 90% of moisture, and by reducing this moisture to less than 10%, that's the goal when you're dehydrating vegetables. Large amounts of natural sugars in fruits can be preserved if the moisture content is reduced to 20% for those fruits and leathers. And to effectively dry foods, moisture must be removed rapidly enough to prevent microbial growth before the food becomes dry. The moisture must also be removed at a temperature that does not seriously affect the flavor, the texture, and the color, and the nutritional value. Drying reduces the volume of food substantially, so storage of dried food is more conservative for space than canning or freezing. So how does food become preserved when you're drying? Drying food removes the moisture from the food. That reduces bacteria, yeast, and molds from growing and results in spoiled food. So keep in mind, food does not, when you dry food, it does not destroy microorganisms or inactivate spores, but it will prevent them from growing. This is an important thing to know. If the food becomes moist again, the microbes will become active and spores can continue to grow at that point. So remember, drying food does not destroy microorganisms or inactivate those spores. Drying also does not destroy parasites, which may occur in meats, especially those wild games. Therefore, you need to take special precautions when you're drying foods such as jerkies or the meats per se. So remember that drying does not destroy parasites and it does not destroy microorganisms or inactivate spores. You need to take into consideration how long it takes to remove water from the food to prevent this microbial growth. Unfortunately, you have to have, well, not unfortunately, but fortunately, you need low humidity for drying. And in Indiana, that is not a normal environment that we see every day. We don't have a lot of low humid days in the summer when you have those higher temperatures that are needed for drying food. So that's when dehydrators come into play, and they're helpful in this situation to make drying food successful. The other thing is you need fans on your dehydrators to make them more efficient. We need temperature for drying food. Water is removed from your food most rapidly at higher temperatures, and you have to make sure that these temperatures are not exceeding where you're actually cooking the food. If you use too high of a temperature over like 140 degrees Fahrenheit, you can actually start to cook the food, which causes a situation called case hardening. And this is when the exterior parts of the food become really hard, and then it's soft inside, which can result in mold growth inside the food. If temperature is too low at the beginning, the food may have a poor quality, and then it can affect bacterial growth to occur as well. So drying, is it energy efficient? Well, it's not as energy efficient as many people think. In Indiana and other Midwest states, the temperature and humidity of our summers make it hard to do any kind of solar or sun drying. So that means you have to use another form of energy in order to dehydrate the food. So you either have to use a dehydrator or some other method which requires energy through, an electrical source of what, or your oven and that sort of thing. The cost for foods that you might freeze versus dehydrate, you're going to have the cost of freezing your food in a refrigerator or freezer. So there are different energy demands of different types of food preservation methods. So depending on what method you're using to dry your food would determine how much energy you're using for that particular food. For the nutritional value of dehydrated food, it's not always the recommended procedure for optimizing and maintaining the nutritional value of food. There are some vitamins that are sensitive to heat and to light. And those that are more susceptible are vitamin C, E, and some B vitamins that are more susceptible to light and heat. And long periods of the food being exposed to that warm temperature in the drying process can destroy some of these nutrients and vitamins that our bodies would normally get from the food if it were not dehydrated. Vitamins A, C, and E are also sensitive to oxygen, and these get progressively lost during the oxidization of the food when it's exposed to both air and the drying process, and also during storage. However, if you're dehydrating food as a way to use this food like for a backpacking trip, yes, there might be some nutritional loss, but you might take into account that you're still able to have nutritious food in a situation where you need that dehydrated state to help preserve it in a way that if you don't have refrigeration to carry the food with you, it's a way for you to still have nutritious food that you've grown in a preserved state. So yes, you might be giving up some nutritional value, but there are times when this is an ideal method of preserving your food. So what types of foods do you want to dry? Well, there's a lot of reasons in which you should pick particularly certain foods. You want to consider foods that you have in quantity. Don't go out and buy foods just to dry foods. The purpose of drying is a sense of food preservation. If you have plenty in one thing, and you want to save it for a later date. That's the whole purpose of food preservation. So you want to think about the foods that you might have in large quantities that are going to go to waste if you don't preserve them in some way. You also want to dry what you know your family will eat. If the food is not something they're going to eat when it's fresh, the likelihood of them eating it when it's dried is probably pretty similar. So you want to make sure that you're preserving foods that you know your family will eat. Certain foods do dehydrate better than others. So you might consider what foods are higher quality foods for dehydrating. There's things like fruits with hard shells, such as pomegranates, are going to be difficult to dry. Fruits that have unstable flavors like citrus are usually not satisfactory in their drying process. Vegetables that have strong flavors, such as Brussels sprouts or cabbage, can get stronger in the process of drying. If you have very young vegetables, they may have a worse quality in their dehydrating process. So the food is not at the peak stage of harvest in order to preserve it in its best status or and the same with herbs and spices. You want to make sure that you're picking them when the plant is young before flowering, because otherwise the herbs can become woody and bitter and have less flavor if they're picked beyond this time when they're in, they haven't blossomed or went to seed. And it is not a good idea to dry milk or eggs at home. These foods can be contaminated with salmonella bacteria and have a good opportunity of growing other bacteria that drying does not kill. There are different methods in which we can dry food at home. We're going to talk about each of these briefly. The first one we're going to look at is sun drying. So this is essentially drying your food outside. This requires hot days of 85 degrees to 100 degrees in temperature, and a night temperature that fall within 20 degrees of that daytime temperature, and relatively low humidity with less than 10%. And you also want to consider low dust and minimal air pollution. So thinking of all of those factors to make sun drying an option in Indiana is not very likely to occur very many days of the year. For those of you that are in other states on the call today might have a different situation where you can be successful at drying in the sun. Actually, the picture on the slide is a picture of cassava or purple yams that are being dehydrated outside. This was done in Trinidad when I was there a couple years ago teaching food preservation, and we did sun drying for them and taught them how to do it. And the conditions were more favorable in the sun than they were using a dehydrator during the time that we were there. So you want to consider these situations based on your environment and what you can successfully dry, whether it's in the sun or using a dehydrator or one of these other methods. I don't know why it's not, there we go, sorry. So next up is talking about foods and the dehydrator. So food dehydrators have the most control over the situation when dehydrating food. They usually have thermostats built in. They're also able to control a temperature range. A lot of times they range between 80 degrees and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can pick the setting for which temperature you need based on the type of food that you're dehydrating. And the other thing is they have racks. They have different racks that you can put different foods on them and dehydrate different foods at the same time, possibly. Or if you only have a small batch, you can take out the number of trays that you don't need to use. Or if you need more, you can add more. If you can see in this picture, it has the white one has like 3 or 4 racks stacked on top of each other on the trays. And if you need to use them all, you can. If you only need a couple, you can take out what you don't use. Dehydrators have a heat source. Most of them have a temperature control, so you can set it for a specific temperature. And I would also recommend that you get one that has a fan, because the fan helps circulate the air and makes it more of an even process of drying that particular food on those trays. The trays are removable and they also can be rotated easily. So that's the nice thing about a food dehydrator. You can move the trays around throughout the drying process to allow the air to circulate evenly through the trays. The fan also creates an opportunity for you to circulate the air if it's already built in to the dehydrator. If you haven't purchased a dehydrator and you're considering it, I would make sure that it has all of these features, that it has a heat source. You can adjust the temperature, and it does have a fan and removable trays. Some even have different types of trays that you can purchase, like extra featured trays, like ones that are for fruit leathers, so it's doesn't have holes in it or has really tiny holes so that the puree doesn't soak through or drip out through the bottom. So you can get different options with food dehydrators. You just want to make sure you look at all of the features before purchasing. All right, I don't know why it's not progressing. It froze. Maybe I froze. Okay, I'm not sure why my slides are not progressing. So we're going to talk about oven drying next. Maybe I can get it to go here in a little bit. There we go. Did that work? Sorry for the mix up here. Okay. So for oven drying, this is done by combining heat, low humidity, and airflow, and the oven is used as your dehydrator. However, with oven drying, there's not a great way to circulate air without opening the oven and setting a fan nearby the oven door, and that helps circulate the air from the oven. The other thing about an oven is that you may not be able to set the temperature low enough for the oven to go below 140 or around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Some ovens just have like a warm setting and you don't really know what temperature that actually is. So with ovens, it's harder to regulate the temperature, and you actually might scorch the food because you can't get the temperature low enough. When using an oven, you have to make sure that you put enough space between the racks and make sure you're rotating the food, especially during the end of the process, because then that's when you're more apt to scorch the food due to the longer time in that heated space that may not have the correct circulation that you need. And it's also not very efficient to have your oven open for such a long period of time and running it. And if you are doing this in the summer months, you're going to be heating up your house. So again, that may not be the most ideal process for dehydrating. Other methods might include solar drying when you use heat as a source. This is similar to sun drying, but you're actually creating like a solar device that helps reflect the sun to create the drying environment. And then vine drying, this you might see with drying beans from your garden, where you dry the bean pods on the vine. And once the beans are rattling in the pod, then you can pick those beans and shell them. There's no pre-treat necessary when you're doing dried beans. You just want to make sure that the beans have been completely dried so that no mold appears or occurs in that process of storage. We want to prevent our foods from darkening when we dehydrate. You're going to see it to some degree for certain foods, but there are ways to pre-treat the food so that it does not dehydrate or does not darken or darken very much. You can pre-treat with ascorbic acid, which is like a powdered mix that you stir in with water, and then you soak the items in that solution for a period of time before you dehydrate them. This is an available product that you can buy in the stores, and it is pretty efficient. It's a little more costly than some of these other things, but it is more simple to do because you just mix it with water and soak it in the food in that slurry or syrup. You can also use a fruit dip, which is just using like fruit juice as its own natural darkening preventer. Honey dip is another method in which you can use for fruits. Again, with honey, you're adding sugar. So it's adding more calories to the item than using something that doesn't add any extra calories. Fruit juice can do the same. It can have some natural sugars that you're adding when you're soaking in those pre-treatments. Same with syrup blanching. It's like a sugar and syrup and water solution. Again, if you're wanting to reduce sugar content, these might not be your first choice in pre-treatments. And with steam blanching, this helps retain color and slows oxidation, but the flavor and texture of the fruit can be changed. And we typically use these treatment methods on fruits. Vegetables, you really don't necessarily have to pre-treat vegetables. You might have to blanch them depending on what the vegetable is and the quality that can be changed in the drying process. These are just some pictures of apples that have been pre-treated in ascorbic acid. After dipping them and soaking them in the bowl, then there's a tray that you can see in the top picture on the left that the apples are kind of draining on a rack and trying to dry off as much of that liquid that you soaked as possible, because drying is removing the liquid from the food to begin with. So once you soak them, they're going to soak up some extra liquid. So you want to drain off that after you've pre-treated it, and then add them to the rack on the dehydrator, as you can see on the picture on the right side. Conditioning fruit is a term that helps you determine or helps you distribute moisture after you have dehydrated your food. So this might take place when you've dehydrated your food. You've got a batch of, let's say apples, and you would put them all in a glass container or plastic after they've been completely cooled. and you seal it and let it sit for 7 to 10 days. And you want to shake the pieces in the container occasionally to separate them so they don't get stuck together. And you check this every 24 hours for condensation. And that's so that any moisture that shows up on the sides of the container or the top, if you see any of that moisture show up within those 10 days, 7 to 10 days, and check it every day. If you see any condensation, then you would return it to the dehydrator for more time. But what the conditioning allows you to do is to redistribute small amounts of moisture. That one thicker piece might have slightly more moisture than another piece. So it allows each piece to kind of redistribute that moisture that's in that container. But if you see it on the sides of the container, that means the food did not get dehydrated enough and it needs to return to the dehydrator. Otherwise, you will find mold happen over time from that lack of moisture or having moisture that hasn't been removed. So how do you know if your food is dry? Well, fruit should be tough, kind of like a leather, a little bit pliable. You don't really think of it as being brittle because fruit has those natural sugars that keeps it a little bit more softened than what you would see in a vegetable that has been dried successfully. Fruit takes anywhere from 6 to 20 hours to dehydrate, depending on what fruit it is. Vegetables, when they are dry, they're going to be brittle. If you bang them on the counter or you hit them with a knife, it's going to shatter or it's going to crack. It's going to be kind of like a potato chip. It's going to be really hard. And so that's removing all but 10% of the moisture. Vegetables will take anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. Again, a lot of it depends on the size of the food, how much liquid or moisture is in it to begin with. And so it's kind of a guessing game. The more you do it, the more experienced you become. It's often a good idea to kind of take notes of like how the progress has been so that the next time you do it, you have more things that you can refer to and get familiar with. It's important that you test for doneness once the food is cooled, because when it's first coming out of the dehydrator, it's going to be warm or potentially hot, and it's going to feel like there's moisture in the food just because of that warmer temperature. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not dehydrated efficiently, so you just need to make sure that it's been completely cooled to determine if it really truly is dried. You can see in the picture here, these apples that I showed in the pre-treatment picture, this is what they look like after they've been dried. And you can see how they've significantly shrunk. Before, they were very, very full on the tray and almost overlapping, which you don't want to put them on the tray overlapping because you want the airflow to be good throughout and be able to get around all of the pieces of the food so it can dehydrate equally from the other pieces. So it does shrink the food down. So even though when you start, the tray is going to be full, it's going to look much smaller of food items once the dehydrating process has been complete. Once you get a successful dried food, you want to make sure that you're storing and packaging it in a way that's going to keep it from taking on any moisture from the air. So make sure that your food has completely cooled before packaging it. You want to package in a moisture and vapor resistant container. So this can be plastic, it can be glass, it can be these Mylar bags. So in this picture, there's a picture or a variety of things in the picture. In the center is this like looks kind of like an aluminum shiny silver bag. This is a Mylar bag that you can use, and they have little oxygen reducer packets that you can add into the bag to help absorb any extra moisture or oxygen. Your plastic baggies are another method of storing your dried foods, or even like a ball jar or a glass canning jar with a lid is another way you can store them, or in like your typical plasticware containers. But as soon as you open them to the air and to moisture, they can soak up that moisture and retain it, and over time can lead to microbial growth. So our food that has been dried, if it's been stored at approximately 60 degrees or cooler, you can keep it for about up to a year if it hasn't been added to any moist or humid, hot, or wet conditions, I should say. And then 6 months if it's been in those warmer temperatures or had any exposure to moisture. And obviously, if there's ever any growth that you see mold growing, you would throw that out, even if it's been within the ideal storage time that's been mentioned. So how do we use our dried foods? Well, you can eat them. You can eat them in a dried form, or you can rehydrate them into like its regular hydrated state. You can add dried vegetables to recipes like soups and stews, or even put them in a blender or food processor and add them as foods like seasonings or soup bases, or even in like smoothies, lots of things like that. Dried fruits make great snacks. They can be used for baking. Some dried foods are going to be better if you rehydrate. Others are good just as they are in a dried state. You just want to make sure that they don't have bacteria, yeast, or molds that have grown based on the presence of moisture and warm air. So to prevent that spoilage, you want to keep anything that's been rehydrated in the refrigerator, just like you would a normal refrigerated vegetable before it was dehydrated, or fruit, because that's going to help stop any microbial growth. Once you rehydrate, you can do this as part of the cooking process. So, if you're making a soup and you put those dried vegetables in it, that can be part of that rehydrating the food. If you're cooking it, the rehydrating process can go faster. So, we're going to talk a little bit about reconstituting that dried food. So there's two methods that you can rehydrate your dried vegetables. One is in cold water. This could take up to 2 hours, where you soak them in water and allow them to plump up to their original shape and size. You don't want them to soak longer than that 2 hours though, because that can start that microbial growth. So at that point, you want to make sure you're putting them in the refrigerator to stop any chance of that happening. You would also, you can also refrigerate, the process while you're doing it. So you can just put them in the cold water in the refrigerator, and that can make it a safer situation when you're rehydrating. You can also rehydrate dried vegetables in boiling water or simmering them into your soups or stews. And this will take less time because of that added heat element. You might ask a little bit about freeze drying versus dehydrating. What's the difference? They are not the exact same process. So we're going to be talking about this on our last session about freeze drying. So stay tuned and join us for that session about freeze drying. And that is the presentation I have on dehydrating foods. We do have a little bit of time for questions, but I do know that we're going to be we'll be sending that follow-up document tomorrow or in the next couple days with more publications, and you can also submit questions. I don't know if any came in during the presentation or not. Abigail's monitoring that. She's also put some information in the chat for links to some information about dehydrating. There's some resources you'll receive in the next couple days that include more recipes on actual types of foods that dehydrate, and those come from a variety of different sources.
Molly, we did not have any questions in the chat box. So any of our participants at this time, if you do have questions, go ahead and place those in the chat box for us.
One of the questions about like where is ideal in which you can dehydrate, I would be cautious. One of the things I didn't really talk a lot about is making sure that your items, if you're using sun or the outdoors to dehydrate, you want to make sure that the food is covered, that there is like a shield because of like bugs and debris that is in the air, because that can become a physical contaminant to the food. So you want to make sure that the food has been protected. Now, the back window of your car, I would probably steer clear of, just because you really aren't able to monitor like how much moisture is in the air in that situation. And I think that there would be more risk for contamination if you have the windows open at the same time. And you want to treat your food just like, in a sanitary manner. So if you're cutting fruits and vegetables up in your kitchen, you want to make sure that you're always washing your utensils in your space. And so I don't know how clean your car window would be in terms of that. So I would probably steer clear of that. It would get hot maybe, but it may not be the best environment. Information about garlic and onion powder. You can, there are ways to dehydrate your onions and your garlic, and then you just grind it up once it's completely dried. Some of the publications that you'll be getting you might actually be able to find a recipe for that, or the National Center might have some information about drying vegetables in that sense, where if you get it in a fine enough powder using like a food mill, you could essentially make your own onion powder by dehydrating onion. So you would just treat it just like you would like a vegetable. I will say that if you using a dehydrator and you're using the trays, one of the things to consider is that you don't don't combine foods that have extreme different flavors. So you probably wouldn't want to dehydrate garlic on the same rotation or set of trays that you're going to be dehydrating apples. Otherwise, you're going to have onion flavored apples or garlic flavored apples because those flavors with the circulation of the air and the heat, even though they might be on different trays, they could kind of permeate the other food. So think about doing them all, like only doing onions at one time and then doing your fruit on another day or different batch so that they aren't taking on those flavors of other foods. Any other questions?
I think the only other one that I saw in there was in regards to food preservation material for youth. And I would highly recommend that you go to the National Center's website. They do on that last slide, I think it was food preservation for youth. They call it Put It Up. So they do have material that you can access as an educator through the National Center. So again, thank you for joining us today for Preserve Smart Dehydration 101. Um, Mark your calendars for next Monday, March 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for pressure canning low acid foods. Thank you.